Think about this for a second. A young kid growing up in New York City. At the time, absolutely no one around him could have known that one day he'd become one of the most recognized figures on the entire planet. A businessman, a television celebrity, a political outsider, and, eventually, President of the United States. Today, we're diving into the story of Donald John Trump. It's a real roller coaster of ambition, wealth, controversy, victory, and resilience. Welcome to The Explainer. So we are looking at the origin story of Donald Trump. We're going to strip away the modern headlines and just objectively trace the chronological roots of his ambition and his, let's say, very unique business style. We'll explore exactly how his early background shaped the strategies he'd later use on the world stage. All right, part 1, the Queen's beginning. Let's look at his early life and family background, starting right on June 14th, 1946. So Donald was born in Queens, New York. He was the fourth of 5 kids. Now, his household was really shaped by 2 very distinct foundational forces. On one side, you've got his dad, Fred Trump. He was a highly successful real estate developer who believed strongly, and I mean strongly, in discipline and hard work. And on the other side, his mother, Mary Ann McLeod Trump, an immigrant from Scotland. Together, they provided a very comfortable life, especially compared to a lot of American families at the time. You know, even from a very early age, Donald's core personality traits were front and center. He displayed immense confidence. He was fiercely competitive. He absolutely loved the spotlight. And he rarely, if ever, accepted defeat. But as he grew older, this unyielding, boundless energy sometimes caused a bit of friction in his daily life. Which brings us to our next section, discipline and education. This is really all about shaping a future developer. Looking at his timeline, a critical pivot happened right in the middle of his adolescence. At age 13, looking to channel all that intense energy, his parents made a huge decision. They enrolled him in the New York Military Academy. And that move set him on a path that would ultimately lead to his 1968 graduation from the prestigious Wharton School. But that middle step, that was absolutely vital. So, the New York Military Academy. This was not your average school. It was an intense environment emphasizing strict discipline, leadership, and responsibility. The schedules were grueling and the rules were heavily enforced. For Donald, this crucible was a massive turning point. It was here that he learned exactly how to compete within rigid structures, eventually gaining leadership positions among his peers and building this rock-solid confidence that would basically define his entire career. After high school, he actually went to Fordham University briefly before transferring to the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School to study economics. But honestly, his real education extended way beyond the lecture halls. He was constantly observing his father's real estate business. He was learning the nuts and bolts of construction, the art of high-stakes negotiations, the massive complexities of financing, and most importantly, exactly how vast wealth could be generated through real estate. And armed with all that knowledge, he was ready for part 3. The Manhattan Gamble, entering a fiercely competitive market. It's 1968. He graduates from Wharton and immediately jumps into the family business. But almost right away, there's a stark contrast. The family business was almost entirely focused on residential properties in the outer boroughs. It was safe, it was predictable, and it was highly lucrative. Most young grads would be absolutely thrilled with that. But Donald's vision? It was totally different. He dreamed bigger. He wanted massive projects, he was willing to stomach much larger risks, and he craved national fame. To him, that meant one thing: conquering Manhattan. But he was walking into a pretty grim landscape. I mean, the 1970s in New York City were incredibly rough. Crime was skyrocketing, economic difficulties were everywhere, and to put it in perspective, terrified investors were literally fleeing the city with their money. But here is the thing. Where the established developers saw extreme danger, Donald Trump saw a golden opportunity. He knew that Manhattan still represented power and prestige, with an enormous financial upside for anyone bold enough to build there. That bold, contrarian perspective led directly to his first major triumph. First, he targets the Commodore Hotel, a place most folks considered a total dead end. Next, he envisions a complete transformation. He works tirelessly, navigating this incredibly complex redevelopment plan with skeptical partners and city officials. And finally, that aging hotel is reborn as the gleaming Grand Hyatt. It was a massive success. It generated huge headlines, and the young developer had officially arrived on the scene. That initial victory naturally propels us into part 4, building the Trump brand, going from a successful developer to a mainstream celebrity. So now, the media is eagerly tracking his career, and business magazines are showcasing his projects. Through the late 70s and early 80s, he expands aggressively. He's chasing even larger developments, constantly seeking more visibility. And that drive ultimately culminated in his absolute crown jewel, Trump Tower, right there on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. As this skyscraper rose into the New York skyline, it became so much more than just glass and steel. It was a powerful physical symbol. It projected immense wealth and staggering ambition, and it permanently tied the Trump name to luxury and success. Essentially, it was the ultimate monument to his own personal brand. With the rise of Trump Tower, his fame exploded far beyond the real estate world. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, he was a national television celebrity. TV interviews were skyrocketing, he was all over the newspapers, and the public became completely fascinated by his luxurious, over-the-top lifestyle. By the 1980s, Donald Trump was, for sure, one of America's most recognizable figures. But expanding at that kind of breakneck pace brings intense new challenges, which brings us to our final section, the looming precipice. Behind the scenes, that immense success brought on even heavier burdens. The financial risks he was taking were increasing exponentially. To actually fund all these massive luxury projects, his debt was growing at a staggering rate. There was this never-ending pressure to just keep expanding, keep the headlines rolling in, and constantly feed the brand. The momentum was incredible, but it was all fueled by a very high-stakes balancing act of leverage and borrowing. So it all leaves us with a really pivotal question. Would Donald Trump rise even higher, or would he lose everything he had worked so hard to create? The next chapter of his life would fundamentally test every single lesson he learned at the military academy and at Wharton. It would test the very foundation of the empire he'd built. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep that question in mind and never stop exploring the history behind the headlines.